welcome back everybody here in the plenary, here in the Weltsaal, in the Auswärtiges Amt, and welcome everybody at home or in the office. Good morning, good evening, depending wherever you are. I'm happy to discuss now with our three distinguished speakers here on the podium a little bit the challenges ahead and reflect on what we have heard over the past 2 days. The title of the session is Resolving Conflict and Clashing Crises, where hard and soft security challenges converge. And I think we should also discuss which are the hard and which are the soft ones that we discussed. I'm happy to do so with our three guests here on the podium. To my left, Jennifer Morgan, State Secretary and Special Envoy for Climate Action here at the Federal Foreign Office. More extensive CVs you find on the internet. You have a long career in international climate policy, and since much has been said about how we bridge civil society, science and politics, I think you did that with the different functions you had with World Resources Institute and Greenpeace International. Next is Benedetta Berti. She is Head of Policy Planning in the Office of the Secretary General of NATO, a foreign policy scholar, analyst, researcher, consultant, professor, author of lots of work dealing across the entire spectrum of conflict analysis, post-conflict stabilization and peace building. And finally, I would like to welcome Nazanine Moshiri. She is with the International Crisis Group, and there you are a senior analyst for climate and security in Africa. You have a long career over 2 decades working for very prestigious media outlets around the globe, looking at development crises of all sorts, of all corners of the world. So I think we're well set. It is difficult really to summarize what we have heard over the past 2 days, but just maybe a few things that I would like to use to introduce our discussion. One thing, since this is the 4th Berlin Climate and Security Conference, is I think we dive deep into the various aspects of climate and security. And if we compare that to a couple of years ago, the discussion that we also had here and at other occasions, it became pretty clear, given the circumstances globally, that climate change is a geopolitical and a geoeconomic issue that we need to deal with. And we're pretty aware what we have heard here over the past 2 days, a lot of commitments by government agencies and international organizations and civil society representatives to commit to very concrete action in order to address these multiple and cascading risks that emanate from climate change. The broad spectrum, I think, is food for thought and the basis for our discussion today. We have a short discussion here on the podium. Later on, I would like to invite you also to join a Q&A session before I hand over then to Jennifer to conclude this conference. First of all, I would like to turn to Nazanine Moshiri, and just to get your reflection on what you have learned, particularly from your perspective working for a peace-building group in the field, because much of what has been said here touches the spectrum, the entire spectrum, from larger institutional arrangements in the global arena to peace-building efforts in the field. Nazanine.
Sure. I mean, I've learned a lot in the past few days. And what the main themes I would say from what we've heard at the conference is that the risks are, of course, multiple, the risks that we're facing, to livelihoods, food systems, water issues. But these linkages really depend on the context. They depend on inequality, governance issues, gender dynamics, and the ability of governments in different regions to adapt to the food insecurity, to these climate extremes that we're seeing. And I would say I have probably 3 main takeaways from what I've heard and what I've learned about the risks and the potential solutions. I would say the first one is that we need to advance multilateral responses, and it was good to hear and good to see that we haven't given up hope on progress at the United Nations Security Council. We have to address these risks in a context-specific way. That's really important, as I just outlined. And the third takeaway I would say is that we need to connect our knowledge and our thoughts to be able to transform this understanding of climate and conflict into more practical, impactful peace-building efforts. So I had many interesting examples, for example, of how much climate change resonates in peace-building, for example, from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and many others. And it is interesting when you are on the ground in the field, depending on how you approach issues of environmental degradation or climate change, how much it does resonate on the ground. So I would say those are my main three takeaways.
And do you think the International Crisis Group or related institutions are in a position to be able really to turn this into, as you described, that concrete action? So when it comes to climate-sensitive peace-building programs, is the information, are the tools available enough, or are there specific requirements so that you could identify?
I think there are many knowledge gaps, I would say, and we need to sort of marry the data. There's a lot of data out there. We're deluged with data. We have to marry that with the on-the-ground realities, whether that be political or conflict dynamics. And for Crisis Group, we're a conflict prevention organization. A lot of what we do is basically granular field research combined with advocacy with decision makers through policy recommendations. And the key message that we hear often from decision makers is we need evidence-based research. So part of what we do is provide that evidence-based research, but I think there are still many knowledge gaps there which need to be filled. So definitely, I think funding for early warning systems that consider the political and the conflict dynamics and the context is really important for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I just remember what Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said yesterday in the opening. We have enough data, we have to turn to action. But maybe that's exactly where we need to turn to, is to collect the information and use the data that is available with the in-situ data and the knowledge that exists basically in the areas and the regions where peace-building organizations are. And if I may say, one of the initiatives that the German Federal Foreign Office kicked off as a contribution to the various initiatives, the Weathering Risk, is exactly picking up on this to organize also this kind of learning. So thank you so much. There are a couple of other things that I would like to ask you later on, but I would like to turn to Benedetta just for a moment. We've heard from François Bausch yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Luxembourg, that what he observed as a distinction between the discourse of security institutions and defense ministries and environment and development communities, something that we observed for a very long time. Would you confirm that? And what's your view on that? What is the kind of platform and fora that we need to develop in order to make that a little bit more fluid?
So first of all, I confirm, I think, but I also would say it's getting much better, and it's getting better at an exponential rate, meaning that when we were trying a few years ago to bring together the military, the humanitarian sector, the diplomatic sector, and of course, organizations like Adelphi has played a really big role in facilitating those discussions. We had to get beyond a lot of reluctance from the different stakeholders because of the different mandates, different organizational cultures. Of course, as the prior panel also mentioned the reasonable concern about securitizing climate intervention, militarization of climate change, and of course the relatively, that I would say, the unfortunate implication that I would carry out. So I think there was a lot of reluctance. At the same time, if I look at where we are now, I think we have done a lot of work to understand each other's mandates, competencies, and added values better. And I think there is an understanding that today, if we talk about sustainable, effective, impactful, long-term agenda that deals with the climate-related risks to peace, we have to think in multilateral terms. We have to think beyond the nation state. We have to think much more at the subnational and cross-national level at the same time, because these are how risks interact. We have to think beyond just state-based approach, so we have to engage in partnerships with private sector, civil society, governments. We know all this a lot more, and I think some of the resistance from the different stakeholders is getting better, so that I think that's a positive signal. We know that we have to be much better also when it comes to bringing together the different perspective. And here I really think the glass is half full in terms that I think today we have internalized, and maybe it took us too long, but today I think we have internalized that climate change affects our securities in ways that are pervasive, persistent, fundamental, and it's not just a tactical issue, it's not just a strategic issue, it's political, it's geoeconomic, it is fundamental to the way we look at the political security trends in the future. So I think that's something that we know a lot better. Practically, I think that means that we are doing a lot better in integrating climate perspectives into how we think about security, from collecting data to indicators and warnings, to mapping risks, to assessing, to devising mitigation strategies. So I think that that part of the debate is in a much more robust position today than a few years ago. I also think we have moved, or we are moving beyond the ad hoc or add-on or case-by-case disaster mentality, meaning I think by now in the security field we understand that there is a climate change crisis. It's going to be permanent. Of course, we're going to have to do better when it comes to mitigation, but even if we do, for the medium to long term, we'll have to deal with pervasive climate risks that are going to affect all dimensions of security. So I think that conversation is going a lot better. Where I would like to see even more progress, and even there I think there is if we're doing better, I think, of integrating climate perspectives into how we think about security. We also need to do just as well when we think about conflict-sensitive, context-specific climate intervention. And I think that's the flip side of the coin, in the sense that I think that for conflict and conflict-related, from peace building, stabilization intervention, and climate intervention to work together, we also need to be, and this I will echo the point that was just made previously. We have to be deeply aware of the political context, of the pre-existing power structures, of the structural inequalities, of the vulnerabilities embedded in the societies where we operate, and really understand that there's no such thing as a neutral climate intervention. When you intervene in an area that is fragile or contested, what you do will have a political impact, and it has to be absolutely a priority, in my opinion, that impact is conscious of structural inequalities, doesn't exacerbate them, and takes into consideration how climate action will impact on conflict dynamics and on more vulnerable communities. Here, I think we still have a little bit of thinking to do, but overall, I would say that we are in a better place than we were even last year.
Maybe just to follow up, one very short question. Does NATO make a distinction between hard and soft security when it comes to climate?
NATO, I don't know.
Should NATO make a distinction?
Can Benedetta answer as opposed to NATO, so then I can say what I want? No, I mean, I think that, okay, hard and soft security, I'm quite skeptical, meaning that I think that, of course, traditionally we always distinguished, but the distinction carried, I think, some at times problematic policy conclusions, meaning that traditionally we think that real serious security is hard security. That means threats against the state posed by other states. We thought in military terms, and making us think in military terms in terms of solutions. There is a role, of course, I am absolutely, from my point of view, there's a very important role for national security considerations and for defense considerations in how we think about security, but that's not enough. Today, more than ever, it's not enough, and I feel that distinction can sometimes be misleading. For example, it leads us to think that soft security has lesser impact in terms of consequences, right? And I think that's profoundly problematic. Think about the COVID pandemic, you know? We would have thought this is nothing to do with security, this has nothing to do with defense. But if you look at the effects on the ground, this has a strategic geopolitical impact as well as a deep impact on our ability to conduct our business as militaries. So I think if we get too caught up on this soft, hard security, we risk missing the bigger picture. And then I would also add another example. I think more and more we see that we may think in these terms. We may want to compartmentalize, and that sometimes there's a good reason for that. But we live in a world in which these distinctions are more and more blurred. For example, energy policies. Are they a security issue or they're an economic issue? Well, I would argue today you cannot say that they're just an economic issue or just a soft security issue. If you if you have a system that results in strategic dependencies on potential competitors, those can be weaponized, those can be exploited, and I think we see that today, and hopefully this will be a lessons learned for us in the future. So I'm very, very skeptical about drawing too clear distinction between hard and soft security. I think when it comes to climate security, peace building, conflict, we should think in terms of civilian-centered. So things about what are we securing? So going to the civilians as the center of what we're thinking. And then building sustainable solutions, and those require different tools. There is a role for the military, it's an important role, but by itself, it will not bring sustainable peace, we know that. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So I think it's important that we think in terms of coalitions and in terms of using all the tools at the right time. So in that sense, sometimes I think the hard, soft security may not be the lens through which we want to look at conflict. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Benedetta. Jennifer, when it comes to the question of taking action, I think I would like to give you the floor just to generally reflect on what we have heard here. But I would like to combine it also with an experience that we made. Exactly 20 years ago, my colleague Dennis Tensler wrote in a study on behalf of the Ministry for the Environment about climate and international security and how we can introduce that topic into the framework of the Climate Convention on the COPs. And when we presented that study in Bonn at that time, we got some pushbacks, basically saying from climate directors all over in the room to say, this is overburdening the agenda. It doesn't help really to put security on the agenda. Now we use increasingly the argument of global risks, of reaching the tipping points with cascading effects, framing climate policy as a geopolitical risk. Is that now an avenue to raise ambition, to encourage countries also to invest into better and more mitigation efforts?
Yeah, I can imagine what that conversation was probably like. I think the framing of going in the direction of global risks and the geopolitical risks that are there from climate impacts, and I actually would like to broaden out the discussion a little bit also into the security risks from the responses to climate change as well. But I think that is more encompassing, and I think, you know, as we've discussed, if you want to include the climate community in this, and I think that's important because it is an important constituency, then I think connecting it more into the language, as we've discussed, is different. I find it disturbing and fascinating at the same time, and if it wasn't so urgent, I think it would be, could write dissertations on it. But because I think in the climate community now, I mean, we're coming into a COP. We'll be doing a side event on climate and security, and I think connecting it into the discussions that are there about what is a global adaptation goal on food security and water security, right? And what does that mean for how the climate system and governance system needs to respond? How do we get the funding that is being collected into projects on the ground that reduce those insecurities in a way that is context specific? Like that's a cascade that I think can work. But I think the bigger thing now, in a way, is you mentioned it, is the energy and climate security. And maybe 2 points there. I mean, if you ever had to wonder, those of us who've been talking about energy and climate security being two sides of the same coin and looking at peace in this moment of history with the Russian war of aggression on with using fossil fuels as a weapon, well then hopefully that will help wake up that discussion more to connect it in. And so that I don't like the division between hard and soft security either, but I think the security community and the defense community can engage and see actually the risk that fossil fuel exploration brings to national and international security, and then hopefully would engage in those discussions. Because I think there's many things to do, and mitigation, if we maybe unpack mitigation, I'd be curious to get more of your thoughts on this, but if we unpack mitigation more, I mean, I think it often comes in the security community of either the emissions of different missions or of troops on the ground or of a Defense Department. But I think that it's in the interest of that community actually to help contribute to getting emissions down. Because that would reduce the focus or the need for, I mean, it would hopefully help and reduce conflict over time, but also long-term would put more of a focus on the ability to build resilience and adapt and not have to have as many losses, damages, and conflicts and wars. So that's maybe a bit of a riff, but I think it's really quite important because I think quickly one can go into assessing what the conflict is and the data and responding on the ground through peacekeeping. That's very important, through adaptation, through loss and damage, but actually we all need to do all of it. And I think we see that very much now, how important it is to get emissions down to zero and phase out fossil fuels and phase up renewable energy and energy efficiency as peace-building measures as well, to kind of use security language in all of this too. And so yeah, I mean, I think getting those voices of security in is good. I think understanding from an environmental perspective and also security that I've heard a lot over the last 2 days of the entry point of being able to discuss issues through the environment or through climate. That was my experience last week when I was in Kigali. We did a full-day workshop on climate and security, and then in Nairobi met with your colleagues and others, and they were I found it fascinating from many different stakeholders and really having this kind of an inclusive approach that just the terminology opened up a whole different discussion. And whether it be about security in the Eastern Congo, eastern part of the DRC, or whether it be about terrorism that occurs in terrorist groups that can recruit, and then you see the plethora of it all. So that's, I mean, I think if we come back to the COP and to the UNFCCC, I mean, I think we've known for a while, this is one of the main conclusions when I was review editor of the last IPCC report, that it's not just about the UNFCCC. It's an incredibly important multilateral negotiation, but it's climate, it has to be integrated into everything now. And so, you know, there was kind of a diagram there that looked at the Framework Convention as the main kind of multilateral, multinational governance structure, but then looking at the other bodies that are out there on the regional level, looking at the importance of engagement locally on the ground and seeing really the full spectrum. So I think, but then having to break it down to make it understandable.
Just a quick follow-up on one point that you just mentioned. It's the question of language, and I think in two directions. One is, Benedetta, you also said, okay, crossing the different silos that we have also requires to translation, and we also heard from Nazanine that when you're operating on the ground, it's also a question of what we are talking about. If you come with a climate and security agenda, I think this is also what you experienced then last week in Kenya, is that they're working on these things, but they use a completely different narrative. My question is, beyond the language that we use, does this automatically also require to differentiate in the kind of policy approaches that we apply? Depending on the community you talk to, depending on the subject, whether you frame an issue in the Congo Basin as a threat to livelihood threat to the local population, or whether you talk in terms of dealing with a looming food crisis, or whether you frame this as getting along with existing political and societal frameworks that exist there on the ground.
I think it really depends on who you are and who you're talking to. I mean, often in my experience, in parts of the Horn of Africa, often the response to many of these issues, which include long-standing historical grievances over land, issues of non-state actors taking advantage of climate extremes such as floods and droughts to use the opportunity to win the hearts and minds of populations, but also use it as a punitive measure against populations who they deem to be, a threat to them. So it really depends on who you're talking to. I think the problem often that we see is that there is often a very strong, hard security response to some of these issues. And that's the first port of call, that's the first answer when something does go wrong or when something does happen. And I think that creates a sense of mistrust amongst many populations and communities. And again, I think we've heard here from many people here that when you go to communities and you bring up the subject of climate change, you're often going to get a blank stare. Like, you're not going to get the answers that you're looking for. But if you adapt the language that you use, whereby you talk about environmental degradation, you talk about deforestation, you talk about charcoal, you talk about the death of livestock, you talk about veterinary care, you bring in those kinds of subjects and issues, then you get a far more nuanced approach and response. So it really, really depends on the context and the subject.
Thank you. Benedetta, how would you reflect there on the defense community? I mean, I assume there is a similar challenge in terms of translation and context.
Right, absolutely, and actually I would completely subscribe to everything that was just said, just adapted to having the same conversation in the defense community. Of course, there's a few I think I agree with recognizing what is the context where you're talking to, what are the expressions of climate change on the ground that are affecting that particular community or the particular interlocutor you're engaging with. That's a good entry point. You want to talk about things that are practical. And I say this because when we started reflecting about how to bring a climate security agenda phrased as such as NATO, one of the first things we did was conversation with our military colleagues. And at the beginning, there was a little bit of question marks. What are you trying to do? And the most effective tool was really to go into scenario building, go into tabletop exercising, and think through what are the practical implications of climate change on their mission, because that's what they are there to do. So if at the beginning, I would say you can find some very theoretical reluctance. Oh, well, this is not what we're supposed to do, which is reasonable. Then you have to articulate why you should care. And the why you should care, the previous panelists did a much better job than I could ever at articulating why, well, operating in wetter, wilder, hotter, drier climates will affect your equipment. You may have equipment which is not fit for purpose, or you may have an entire reinforcement plan that will be severely impacted if there are floods. There's all sorts of, or your military bases might be under rising sea levels and not fit for purpose. There's so many practical examples that I think you can bring. So just to relate, to build on the point that it depends who you talk to, and I think in the defense community that was very much the approach. But then to return to just to build on another point, and I don't think we've mentioned we have mentioned climate justice yet, but I think when you talk about climate security in communities that are vulnerable, you have to recognize that there are trade-offs. And depending where you sit and what's your perspective, you may think that the climate agenda is the most important one, and certainly I would argue it's fundamental, but you also need to put yourself in the position of those communities who are making very, very difficult trade-off between livelihood, immediate sustenance, and climate. And then be honest about those trade-offs, and I would say also bring an element of recognition of the pre-existing grievances and inequalities that lead them to have to make those decisions. So in other words, yes, we need to talk, but also maybe to listen a little bit more on these topics.
Maybe just to shift to a series of shorter questions on the international architecture that we have in order to respond to that kind of challenges. One of the outcomes of the German presidency in the Security Council in tabling climate and climate crisis or climate issues there in 2011, 2012, and also most recently in 2020 was that we need to bring this topic to the attention of regional organizations, African Union, Arab League, ASEAN, etc. And that relates to the point that we need to translate that. We also need to translate that because they have a specific mandate, and they have a specific legitimacy. They reach out to stakeholders. It is rooted there in the kind of broader context of security, trade, and social issues. My question is, to some extent we see progress there, but regional organizations are still hesitating really to have strong programs in place, even though I would say they are well suited to do so. How can we help the institutions, maybe also from a little bit of the backgrounds that you either have with dealing with these organizations, or Benedetta, also from a NATO point of view, because there are constraints to do that. So what kind of assistance we can offer to these institutions?
Well, I certainly think in my region, I think the African Union is leading the way in terms of this debate on climate and security, peace and security. They are definitely, way ahead of many other institutions in terms of the language they're using and the seriousness they're taking the subject. EGAD, also in our region, they are leading the way in terms of early warning for both climate and conflict. I think there are some issues there in terms of disseminating of information, information sharing. But certainly they are already progressing, far more than other regions in terms of the work that they're doing and the importance of the work they're doing, and coming up with concrete policy recommendations for many member states. I think the problem is, as we've constantly mentioned here, it is funding. I think the political will is there, but they need more money, basically, to be able to implement the many great policies and policy recommendations that they've come up with.
Sure. I think for and I'll speak maybe focusing on the NATO element, and I think that can be an example. I think it's important to think through what is the mandate, what is the competency, and what is the added value and tools that each organization have. And in that sense, what is the most useful and effective way to utilize that organization. I think in the case of NATO, the first question we had to answer is, does this matter to our key mission? And our key mission is preserve the security and defense of allies. And the answer is yes. If this is a generational challenge that impacts the way our military operates, our strategic environment at home, our neighborhood, then yes, it has a direct impact on security. Therefore, we cannot afford not to think about it. We cannot afford not to adapt. We cannot afford not to cooperate. We cannot afford not to play a role in mitigation. That's also part of how you remain consistent with your mission and your values as an alliance. So I think for us, it was really what's the added value that we can bring, and how does this relate to our core mission? Because of course, there's so many things in the world that are important, and so many things, as I mentioned before, that affect our security. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can be first responders on all. But I think the general political debate with the allies was, yes, there is an added value. We have expertise. We have a very long practice in investing in green technologies, in working on fuel efficiency, in designing and applying environmental standards. There's so much that we can contribute to. Of course, being also realistic and knowing this is a much broader challenge, so we can only be one piece of the puzzle. So for us, it was very much focusing on what we can contribute and how we can work with others.
Benedetta, you mentioned that when you made the point of that the defense community need to learn from on climate issues, but also make climate interventions conflict sensitive. There's a larger discussion going on, and also tools developed on assisting organizations and countries to do climate adaptation, or to implement climate adaptation measures in fragile and conflict-prone environments. My point is, where do we need to organize the learnings on these institutions? That was a little bit my understanding, and following the discussion here in Berlin over the past 2 days, that the Berlin Climate Security Conference, at least here, one thing that they achieved is that we start talking about where we succeeded and where we failed, or at least the constraints that we're facing, because they are not so different from program to program or organization to organization. One conference can do that. But what is your idea about how to organize this kind of learning? There was an intervention yesterday. What's the role of civil society and research organizations, and some of the initiatives also Weathering Risk here that is funded and initiated by the Foreign Office? There is an evaluation component built into the programs, because we need to learn to continuously improve policy initiatives. But where else do we need to have that kind of learning?
I would say, I'm brainstorming here, but I would say that the general trend and the general point is that when operating in areas of conflict, fragile context, but in general, but liminal areas of liminal and contested power, we have, and this is not just a climate community myth, is also something that we have, I think, had from a development perspective, from a security assistance perspective. It was often this idea that we could be technical, that we could intervene in those contexts without taking the politics into consideration and build a water well in the most efficient place in a village. But that's not how the world works. Everything is embedded in politics. Everything is embedded on pre-existing power dynamics. Everything that you do in a community will affect the balance of power and can either exacerbate or not exacerbate inequalities. So my point would be, I think that a first step is we need to change, and I think this is already happening. So I don't think I'm breaking great new ground here, but I think we need to be conscious of the political impact of development, of climate action, of security assistance, of everything we do. It is embedded in politics, and therefore we need to be aware of it. There's many ways to do that. Partly is we have organizations like the International Crisis Group that do fantastic work on the ground, explaining how different interventions can affect pre-existing pre-existing political dynamics. We should embed conflict analysts into our response teams. We should have a much more, and this already we know, we need to work with the communities and not provide for, and not think about them as a client, but as a essential part of how we think about any type of intervention. So I think this applies to climate action, but it applies much more broadly to everything we do in context areas. We need to be we need to be aware. We need to be conflict sensitive. We need to have the expertise, and all of this points to the importance of involving local actors and sometimes also being open to discussions with non-traditional partners. So sometimes also get beyond our own biases as what governance looks like, what security looks like, and who is a provider, and maybe look at who functionally is delivering for the community as opposed to just the title. But this is just brainstorming here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Nazanine?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, I think, that we need increased funding for climate adaptation in conflict areas, particularly across the Horn and the Sahel. But we need to work with local partners, as you've mentioned there. We need to take into account local political and ethnic dimensions. And we need to identify feasible projects. And I think another important point is we need to favor grants over loans, particularly in these fragile contexts. And we need to work to strengthen local governance and take into account those most vulnerable to these climate risks, not just women and children, of course, but also marginalized groups. And there are several ways we can do that. We can focus on improving livelihoods, for example, for pastoralist communities, promoting sustainable livestock practices. That's just one example of what we can do. And I know that EGAD does work on that in the Horn context, and we can support the work that they do on transhumance, for example. This allows pastoralists to, adapt to climate extremes by moving across borders, for example. We can promote community-based watershed management, community-managed construction of boreholes, etc. Again, taking into account all these local contexts. I'll just give you two examples from my experience and from my research. In an area of Kenya called Baringo, where we've seen a lot of intercommunal violence, there is a locally embedded charitable trust that basically provides drought-resistant grass seeds to pastoralists. And it's locally embedded, and it's locally supported. And we have seen an impact there. We've seen pastoralists who were previously involved in armed raiding, putting down their arms and deciding to grow grass for fodder for their cattle. So there's been a real impact there. And just to give you another example, and this is why it's so important to do field research, as Crisis Group does, and also Adelphi has done as well, in Mali, for example. When you speak to people on the ground, people in the camps for displaced in Baidoa right now, which is at the epicenter of the predicted famine in Somalia, they will tell you that the thing that they want the most, of course, is security and peace and to be able to go home, but they want a source of livelihood. They want to sustain themselves, and they want to trust the people who are helping them. So communicating with people who have been displaced, working out what it is they need to be able to sustain their livelihoods if they leave those urban centers and go back to their farms or go back to their semi-nomadic pastoralist life. What is it they need? So we need to hear from those marginalized communities who are often marginalized within their own countries, within their own communities too. So I think that's really important, to listen to what they need and what they want.
Okay, thank you. I would like to pass on just to Jennifer on reflection also on this kind of how we organize learnings and how we put that into political practice.
I think it's a fundamental question, and also maybe a bit in brainstorming mode, but I think that we have to invest in communications and storytelling more. Because I think just the examples you just stated are so powerful. They bring it to life, and they're real to other communities. And how to actually, I mean, NGOs do a lot of that kind of work, but I think bringing, and that's part of the peace building pillar, but I think oftentimes there's so much, there is activity happening on the ground, we are learning, but it's not, the stories and the examples aren't necessarily being told in a way that's transferable to others. And so I think using different institutions to be able to do that, everything from the German embassies, I mean, our embassies are really interested. Just last week we had 2 events in actually engaging on this with local communities. And I think if the more examples, concrete examples that come from different perspectives, like you were saying, you start with the issue that people are worried about and that they're trying to work through, and then you bring that into different forums, out in the field or in Capital. I think, you know, and whether you do that, whether we could do it through our own kind of institutions that are there, but others, in a way, I think that could be very powerful, and because I think there is a lot of excellent work happening on the ground, but magnifying that and accelerating that learning. And then I think we've talked a little bit about the learnings of getting more and more climate expertise in peacekeeping missions, and then creating communities of practice in a way of that very deliberately. I think is another specific idea as well, so that then you can actually be benefiting from what's been done before.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to open the floor. If you would like to join us by a question or a comment or an observation that you would like to share with us, please just raise your hand and mics will be available. The problem is I don't see anything because of the lights here, but I think the mics will reach you. Yeah, it's going somewhere in the end. So please, if you don't mind just introducing yourself.
Thanks a lot. I'm Tanvir Kabir, Counselor Political from the Embassy of Bangladesh in Berlin. What I have understood from Her Excellency Jennifer Morgan's speech about water security, in our region, in South Asia, we share common rivers. And in African continent also, common rivers are an issue. So my question is that, say for example, German development agencies, they give funds to different countries in South Asia. But if the reason of the climate crisis in future would be like diversification of water by building dams by different countries, upper riparian to lower riparian, then the funds go into drain because German government funded projects are being done, but there is no consensus about, the security threats and the rise of militancy or terrorism. In that context, I would like to say that water security, should be an important issue for our countries, and natural resources management should come into force, and before giving any funds, it should be ensured that such activities are not done by any upper riparian countries. Then loss and damage would be huge. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. On water security, natural resource management fits a little bit into the discussion of making that conflict sensitive. Any other question, comment? We have 2 here in the front, 3.
Thank you. My name is Erika Pepe. I work for IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. So you all mentioned that responses to climate security-related challenges rely on the ability of governments to adapt and respond to the challenges that we've discussed during these past 2 days here. And you also somehow all agree that this should consider ground realities in a way which is context-specific and involve local actors. And if we consider the context where the legitimacy and capability of governments have been eroding, we can also argue that non-state armed groups can play a critical role in addressing those challenges in the areas under their influence. And so what is, in your opinion, an effective way to involve non-state armed groups in addressing climate issues?
Good question, thank you.
Shall I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Roel Ryland, Luxembourg Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm the Deputy Director General for Defense. Defense is a part of foreign affairs in Luxembourg. Thank you for this extremely relevant final debate here. I agree very much with many of the points that have been raised, in particular, and I would like to add that we need a massive increase of human and financial resources for conflict prevention, mediation, and environmental peacemaking. So all this kind of soft, whatever you call it, soft approach, if you want. I also agree with the idea that we need to listen much more to the communities. I would like to add there that we need them to take the lead. We need more local ownership. They need to drive the processes. Obviously, this takes time, so we need to prepare for higher transaction costs and for financing those. And of course, we need to be a bit patient. These kind of processes take time. What we need to look at, in my view, is also that these processes are inclusive, that none of the affected communities are excluded, and therefore it is, in my understanding, very important that we know more about the socio-economic underlying dynamics that exist in countries. So there is research out there. I wonder whether it is sufficient. And if it is sufficient, we will definitely have to improve the science policy interface so that we understand more. I think we have a fair amount of knowledge now about the climate dynamics, the biophysical impacts. But what we don't understand very well, and there maybe we could ask our embassies and EU delegations, etc., task them more specifically to understand more the socio-economic, the ethnological, etc., dynamics that exists. So I think this would be extremely important additions to the very interesting debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
We have a last comment here, first row.
Good afternoon. My name is Isabelle Poupard. I am the Deputy Head of Mission of Canada here in Berlin. I just wanted to mention in the context of the debate this afternoon that in response to some of the challenges so ably discussed by the panel this afternoon, Canada is in the process of establishing a NATO Center of Excellence on climate change and security. From what I understand, we have been taking a very consultative, collaborative approach in establishing it. And we have even launched a public opinion research survey, which is accessible on our foreign ministry website. And I would like to encourage everybody in this room to go check it out and fill it if you would like to, because all contributions are very much welcome as we prepare to establish this center. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I would like to just turn to the podium, leave it up to you which one you want to pick. It was on water security and natural resource management. It was the question of how to involve non-state armed groups in peace-building processes. Yeah, Yeah, that's what I have assumed, and what we heard from Luxembourg is a little bit a very important aspect of local ownership, and how can we better understand and bridge the gap between policymaking institutions and the kind of needs they had on contextual knowledge. Nazanine, why don't we start with the armed groups?
Yeah, we often see non-state actors taking advantage of these situations, and sometimes actually helping where they can. For example, in Mexico, we have criminal gangs handing out humanitarian aid after disasters. We call it narco aid. In the case of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, I've been investigating Al-Shabaab since 2011. I was on the UN Security Council's panel of experts. So, Al-Shabaab, as a militant group linked to Al-Qaeda, as you well know, it portrays itself as a shadow government, as an alternative service provider, particularly during this drought and previous droughts. You see the propaganda, videos of them handing out aid, drought relief. But the reality is very different, and this comes from our research at Crisis Group, that in fact Al-Shabaab is one of the reasons why the country is facing the potential of famine. They're not in fact helping people and providing drought relief in the same way as the United Nations would like to do. But at the same time, they do control large swathes of the country. So around 740,000 people live in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. 1.4 million people live in areas either controlled or influenced by the group. So how do we reach those people without even being able to talk to Al-Shabaab or have any kind of dialogue with this militant group that's viewed as a terrorist organization by many people in this room? So those are really important questions. And I think the risk appetite, because of the current situation, the risk appetite has gone up amongst many humanitarian agencies and groups, not just for providing humanitarian aid, but potentially, providing future climate resilience. But really, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to talk to non-state actors like Al-Shabaab to do that? I think the Crisis Group would advocate for preparing the ground to talk to the group, and it has to come from Somalis, and it has to be Somali-led in the future. Are we quite there yet? I don't know the answer to that. The country is at war right now with Al-Shabaab, and there are people suffering from conflict and climate. But there has to be room and opportunities there to talk to non-state actors, I think, when the situation is as serious and dire as it is in Somalia right now.
Yeah, I'll just also, I cannot help, before working at NATO, I spent about 10 years dealing with the issue of non-state armed groups, security governance and access, and how to gain access for humanitarian assistance, so I cannot not jump on the question as well. First of all, I completely agree with the framework. The issue, there is a clear reality, and the reality is that in areas of limited statehood, in large parts of the world, and sometimes we use this global north, global south dichotomy. It's really not like that. There's areas, even in the global north, where control security is not provided by the state. That is a fact, and you use the example of Mexico, of the post-disaster relief assistance by narcos, but there's so many others. So the point is, we know that large part of the world, if you want to be effective on the ground, you need to deal with actors that are not the state. That's known. You also know that as governments or international organizations, we are state-centered and state-based, and we think through state-to-state partnerships. That's the way we're set up. So there is already a trade-off and a tension there that we need to solve on a case-by-case basis. At the same time, of course, we have to be very careful not to fall into an alternative prism by which we automatically say whoever's on the ground and has effective governance should really be our partner. That requires some really long discussions and reflection. You have to make a trade-off. Sometimes the only way to gain access is to negotiate with an actor that is involved in human rights abuses, is involved in making vulnerable communities even more vulnerable. And by negotiating and engaging, you are giving some level of legitimacy. At the same time, if you don't engage at all, you may not be able to be there at all. So it's trade-off dealing with bad choices, and that's, I think, what we do on a case-by-case basis. And just the last point, I think you need to be very aware, again, of the context and aware of what are the characteristics of that particular non-state actors you're dealing with. And that's what I was saying before when I was talking about functionality. Do they meet? Are they providing security in a way that is effective? Are they providing security in a way that is accountable? What happens when there's violations? Is there a mechanism? In some cases, I don't want to bore you, but in some cases, yes. And that gives you a very different understanding. Is there a relationship with the community? Are they representative of the community, or are they imposed on the community? There's so many factors that I think a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work in the real world. But I agree that it's a really important question. We need to ask ourselves, in much of the world, if you want to provide security, or you need to talk not just to the state. That's a fact. Yeah.
Jennifer, there were two remarks, one on water security. I think that is one of the areas where we can learn a lot. There are international initiatives like the Water for Peace initiative. There's the Foreign Office initiative on water in Central Asia. There are plenty of things that we have learned, not just on the upstream, downstream aspect of shared transboundary waters. There was also a very interesting comment made to say, can we engage the embassies around the world to collect the information that we would need? Maybe you want to just pick up one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the water security, from the colleague from Bangladesh, I mean, I think indeed, I think the approach that we've been working on within Central Asia and also looking in the Nile Delta is on a regional perspective, bringing information in, doing a lot of convening with local actors, and then what I heard also is making sure that informs any project development that has to do with water as well. And I think when I was in Bangladesh, that was the first trip I went on as special envoy, I heard a lot about both on the water side and also on the need for regional dialogue on climate migration as well, which is a whole nother vastly important, challenging field, and looking for regional solutions there. So maybe we should look and see, perhaps as part of our peace pillar, to see if there's, I'm sure there's already regional dialogues happening there, but also to inform our own decision-making, what we could learn from that. And a colleague from Luxembourg, I mean, I think I agree with everything that you said, and I think it's not only in regards to this field, it's in regards for all of our foreign policy, frankly. So, and I think that's the pathway that Germany is on, led by Minister Baerbock, to be inclusive, to be listening. I think she said at the United Nations, we hear you, understanding that the conflicts that we're dealing with now in Europe are far away often from what's happening on the ground, but and really working on eye level with partners in developing countries, but not only, in a different way, with some humility, and then looking at, yes, values-based foreign policy, but also there are interests that they have as well. And so we haven't talked very much here, there were other two issues that maybe we can look at in the future. One was the new geopolitics of energy. And talk about, in some of the failed states and also how we're looking very carefully at this and thinking, and not only thinking, but engaging on it, and how do we manage that transition and that world in a better way than we've managed fossil fuel resources. And the other is risks on geoengineering, which I think is something that I think there was these are just anecdotes, but I just have to kind of share with this audience, because there was, China recently did cloud seeding in its clouds in order to be able to fill the Yangtze, right? So, I mean, I would think NATO's looking at that perhaps, but these incoming risks to security, but to people, I think are other ones. And I think listening and feeding back on that is key. And indeed, on the embassies, I think we're working, we had our annual ambassadors conference here, and climate change, climate security was a major topic, and our embassies are also looking, how can they be collecting information, how can we be having a two-way conversation there? And I think the point was just about all of the it's not just what's the climate policy, right? It's really much deeper than that, and understanding the societal issues that are ongoing so that we can be appropriately responding.
Thank you. So you named already a couple of topics for the next BCSC. One is about the geopolitics of the energy architecture. Another one that we probably hear next year is how Germany managed to get climate on the top of the national security strategy. The International Crisis Group is reporting back on what are the circumstances that we need to improve to create local ownership and local livelihoods as a driver for peace. From NATO, I would like to hear next year about the beginning of the process of rebuilding Ukraine on the front line as an example for building up a sustainable society. Hopefully we can hear something about this. With this, I would like to thank Benedetta and Nazanine very much for your contribution here, of course, for the participation here in the entire conference. And with this, I would like to hand over to Jennifer for the concluding remarks on the 4th BCSC.
Thank you. I mean, what an amazing couple of days. Very rich on many levels of various topics, and one could really see the deep complexity and interlinkages of so many different communities and parts of the world. And I think it's clear that we are in this moment which is very challenging across the world, but also I think we're seeing that there are many people and organizations and governments working to try and find the solutions. So I leave here quite hopeful, actually, in the way forward. I think we talked a lot about the risks, but we didn't stop at the risks. We really moved into defining and improving on the responses. And I think a big thanks to all of you who've collected many ideas, many cards to look at what are the projects, what are the ideas. And I think that these responses will continue collecting next week during the virtual part of the conference. And together with our partners, we launched here the Climate for Peace initiative yesterday. We looked forward to more exchange on lessons learned from concrete climate security projects on the ground, and hopefully plan to implement many new projects and joint projects, whether it be the solar power project for refugee camps in Niger, or many others that we've heard about. And obviously this, as I said, is kind of a bottom-up, we need, process that we need to work together on, and we can be working to pull those out, but we need these to come in from you all. I think this panel was really guided by the question of how to get the mix between hard and soft security right. Whether you agree with the terminology or not, I think is a good question. But they clearly were in a context where they strongly interconnect. Whether that be in the realm of food security, which has been deteriorating dramatically for too many because of armed conflict and climate impacts, and because of the shortcomings of governance mechanisms through which we try to prevent and respond. I think the question of this right mix is really a very difficult one, because the interactions, as you were saying, are really quite complex and the contexts differ. So across geographies, as well as sectors and climate impacts. So we need to better integrate our tools. I think we've heard a lot about that, to ensure that we do no harm, actually, through our actions in one area, whether it's in climate or in peace, but also that we systematically look for those synergies. And I think it really motivates me that we've heard a number of examples and see that, be it the Climate for Peace initiative and its founding declaration, the mediators working in the Weathering Risk Peace Pillar, the OSCE's dialogues in Southeastern Europe, the South Caucasus and Central Asia, the World Food Program efforts to integrate climate security risks into food system support in East Africa, the Preview Project, NATO's efforts. I think, we've just heard multiple examples of that, and I think it's, this year we're really seeing how we're experiencing ourselves, how hard and soft are interlinked. As I said, our vulnerability to fossil fuels makes us more vulnerable to a hard security threat. And so I think we learn that we have to be able to respond in that hard security arena, but we must not and will not limit our response to this domain. We will, as Germany, as Europe, and I think many here in the room, be working to overcome fossil fuel dependence, which is hurting us twice. It's making us dependent on suppliers and increasing our vulnerability, and it's exacerbating climate change. So looking ahead into the upcoming COP, but also beyond, it's clear we have to increase ambition on mitigation, on finance, on adaptation, and on action against loss and damage. And we're calling on all UNFCCC parties, particularly, of course, the major economies, to revisit and increase their level of ambition in order to reduce the losses and damages and impacts. And I think together with our partners, we can be moving these things forward together. And I think it's going to be a very interesting COP to see if your experience from 20 years ago has been going to be different.
Hopeful.
I hope so. I hope so. But I think, also we're also growing, and this is also a cross-cutting theme that I heard in a number of the groups, was feminist foreign policy and the role of women in solutions, in getting things done on the ground. And so we really need to increase the participation of women and girls and youth and indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, because they play an incredibly important role here. And so inclusion was something that I also, I think if you're going to do one of those word clouds, I think that would definitely be one that came out quite well. And, last but not least, the UN Security Council also needs to act. And Gabon put on the table climate security in Africa on the Security Council agenda today, supporting the growing momentum for the topic to become a regular item for discussion. So I think we are seeing, as Germany, we are very humbled by all of the participation here and all of the partnership. I think we'll continue to work, obviously, starting tomorrow, maybe one break for the team that organized this. I'll come to that. But I think only together, really, can we weather this risk of these risks and these threats. And I think that we're very grateful that you came and shared all of those experiences here at the BCSC, and look forward to continuing the conversations next week. And I think last evening I talked about two things. I hope everybody can maybe, as you're walking out the room, maybe think and share with your neighbor, what is the one or two things that you're going to do differently or you're going to do because of the time you spent here. I try after conferences to write down, okay, let me synthesize. So I'm definitely going to work harder to connect the dots between adaptation, peace building, conflict resolution, and I've got some opportunities there. And I'm also going to take more time to really read and listen to the examples on the ground, and then think about how I can connect those examples onto the ground into this world that I live in. So those are my two actions, and please think about that for yourselves as well. And last but not least, I'd really love it if all the people who helped organize this meeting would just to stand up for a second, because I think, I don't know if you're still in the room, but I can't see you, but please stand up. Thank you so much. Thank you to Adelphi. And conversation has come a far way, and look forward to continuing it. Back over to you.